What's up, guys? This episode is gonna be just like Swiss cheese. Cheesy and full of holes. When you install bolts for Highlines, holes matter a whole lot.
Hi, I'm Ryan Jinks, and welcome to my living room. Today we're gonna talk about bolts and the position of them, where they need to go, and how to consider all this before you put bolts in rocks that are gonna last pretty much forever as long as that rock is there. Once you stick in holes, they're permanent. You can always change bolts, but you can't really change the hole. You can always add glue in it and epoxy, but it still looks bad over time. And after 100 more years of all of this, and every 20 years we're putting in new bolts and new holes, it's kind of gonna start looking like Swiss cheese. So let's consider where we're gonna put all this stuff. The position I have right here with 4 bolts, straight line, is a really common bolt pattern that we've had for years. I live near Yosemite. If you're going to Yosemite, come visit me in Lodi, California. But this is really, really common from where I'm from. Now, if you're in Moab, Utah, they put the bolts pretty far back because the sandstone is soft rock, and they don't want the rock to crumble near an edge. But in my situation, we've had this, and we've learned in the previous videos, series that we've done about equalization is a myth, equalization is not a myth. We just kept changing bolt patterns and forces and stuff like this to see what would equalize all these bolts. Because 4 bolts in a straight line do not pull evenly. They put most of the force on these center bolts. So really the biggest thing we're going to talk about is the master point. Where do you want the master point to be? What I have here is a 10 meter long, 8 millimeter wide diameter rope. And it's a static rope. And what you do in these M12 hangers from boltproducts.com is you go through and you build yourself a BFK. Whoopee slings used to be a thing when we tried to equalize and realized that doesn't actually happen. You just tie a really nice BFK and it will pull on stuff even enough. So you can see here that my BFK is right here on the edge. And I like that the most. I would even consider putting it right here because my web lock will be here and my webbing will be out here. And so my webbing isn't going to rub, get abrasion, and break, which is the #1 risk of a Highline failing. It's very important to pad everything. But this big fat knot is not going to cut through very quickly. You still want to pad the crap out of it, and you probably put a bag under it to kind of lift it up. So it's a little bit easier to work with this. I've seen too many times master points a full meter out away from a cliff edge, which makes tensioning and getting on and off kind of sketchy. Even if you have a personal anchor, you don't really want to be taking a whipper on it. So it's nice to have the master point right here near an edge. Well, how do you accomplish that? In Yosemite, we have our bolts right here. You have to work hard to not have it too far out. And if they were pretty far back, you could always adjust the rope, but you have to consider this part of it before you actually put the holes in. I heard there was a Highline in Colorado that had bolts right here next to the edge. And when you're building an anchor, you don't want to have something that's more than 45 degrees or the forces exponentially get stronger. Ironically, we made a sport out of a death triangle or out of a bad angle, which is what a Highline is. But it's still, when you're building an anchor, you do not want that. So if you had the anchors out like this, that is creating almost twice as much force just at this angle than it is in this position. So after a lot of tests on equalization is a myth, we discovered that 3 bolts is plenty. So after our series, Equalization is a Myth, we kind of discovered that 1 bolt was almost a 10-to-1 safety ratio, 2 bolts is redundant, and 3 is overkill. And we love overkill. But 4 is ridiculous, and that's a lot more holes than we need, and in the leave no trace spirit, unless you're dealing with some pretty soft rock, I don't recommend it. It's not like it even equalizes anyways, and most of the force is on 2 or 3 out of the 4. So here we discovered that a equilateral triangle, or even having this back bolt even further back is going to create more equalization right here, especially when it's a sliding X. Now, it still helps in this configuration if you're going to do a BFK to do a triangle. The most center bolt in line is going to see the most force, and the bolts closest to the anchor is going to see the most force. And you can see how this cancels each other out, because the closest ones and the most center ends up evening out. You can see here that I actually put my BFK a little bit closer to me, and that my web lock is still hanging out this far past the edge. And so my webbing has no risk of abrasion at this point. Even the soft shackle on here doesn't have any risk for abrasion if this tape is signifying the edge. Now, I never leave this stuff unpadded, and I would put a haul bag or something underneath here so it really keeps it lifted up and off, and I secure it down. I don't secure my padding over the top of my anchor because I want to be able to inspect this. Some people wrap the whole thing up, you can't see shit, and you don't know if the thing's safe when you get on. And this is a tailless figure eight, whereas I don't tie a fisherman's in a knot here and then tie my figure eight. It's actually pretty neat because that tail I'm not using. But here I have a locking carabiner that I put on here for a personal anchor if I wanted to make it permanent part of the rig. Now, of course, it's not ideal to be falling like this, but the rope's not going to break in this scenario, and it's nice that people are clipped in when near a cliff edge. And a quick note is the soft shackle here at the master point, the ropes are not rubbing, and so there's no rope on rope abrasion in this situation. Whereas like if you tied your leash in a figure eight and slipped it over the high line, that rope sliding over the webbing would get you killed. That rope on rope abrasion will cut things. But where things are not moving, just like when you tie your leash into your harness, that's technically rope on rope. If things aren't moving, it won't cut through. Another option to consider is 2 bolts. Now, don't beat me up over this, but this bolt is pretty strong. And if I put this in granite, 2 is redundant. And so, there are some Highline locations that do have 2 bolts, and it is kind of nice because in this situation, I still like the BFK in this situation. It just takes a lot less rope, as you can see how much rope I have left over. I could even tie it off to a tree back there if I wanted. But if you are going to use 2 bolts and keep it as minimal as possible, make sure you're using some pretty bomber bolts. We are going to test a lot of bolts on Bolt Busters, and that is Slack Snap's sister. We're going to test hundreds of bolts, and we're going to find out what's safe and our limitations. But the quality of rock and the density of the rock is a huge factor in how strong your bolts are. Most rock fails before the bolts come out. So you just have to take that into consideration before you put in your holes. All this needs to be considered before you start drilling your Swiss cheese. Now you'll notice that my web lock is getting further and further away from the cliff edge. And in this situation, you have to remember, this is more about building anchors than putting in bolt holes, this shit stretches. And if I could really pull on this thing would go out almost to the where after tensioning, this would be, the web lock would be completely over the edge. And it's really nice to have this close and right here when you're working with it. And what I do is, if I don't have any soft goods, jackets, or leftover webbing, I like taking these fabric grocery bags. And because you really can't afford to have your bag slip, you'd have abrasion. You don't like to wrap this stuff too much. It depends on your situation. But I go like this, and I can fill this with sand, fill this with soft goods, whatever. And I can clip that off to there, clip that off to there so it doesn't shift. And right there is really nice to be able to clip in. My rings can slide all the way to here. Walking off is dangerous, but if people decide to do that, they're not trying to jump this 1 meter gap. This is really, really nice. My bolts are not too far away, but they're also not too close. If my bolts were right here, it would be just pert near impossible to create something that wasn't a meter or 2 away from this, which would just be difficult to rig. So if the angle is supposed to be small, and you want it to be, you know, the bolts close to the edge, not too far back, whatever, why don't we put them this close together? You probably never see that, and let me explain why. You need 10 diameters of space in between them. So if these are generally working with 1/2 inch bolts, that is 5 inches away from each other at the minimum. How they quarry stone, how they harvest stone is they'll puncture holes like a perforated paper and then break it off. You don't want to put holes right next to each other. The forces that are created in the rock are like a vector, it's a V shape, and if they're too close to each other and those V's intersect, then you're going to weaken the rock. And remember, the rock's holding your highline up, not your bolts. The bolts are holding the rock. Now, if we want to spread these out, and let's say your condensed straight lines there, it's not going to kill anybody, but you have to consider where the highline is going to go. Now, we've talked about master point as far as distance from the edge, but let's talk about master point in a direction. If the highline is going that way, you don't want to set these this way because all the force is going to be on the closest bolt here. You would want to turn these things in, you want the center bolt to be in direction of the highline. Now, if these are going to be used for multiple use, you can't just put it with the center bolt further back for this line and for this line unless you do the equilateral triangles. So if you try to make it like, let's see here, if you do that, you can find a happy medium, and now this is a center bolt for that line, and this potential future line that you want to do, this is also the center bolt, and all these need to be you need to do is turn these. And a triangle can work for those. Think about the master point, think about the direction of the high line, and think about what pattern you want. And please don't do this right next to the cliff edge. If you put these in wrong, you're probably not going to die. But that just means you're an idiot, and therefore you shouldn't highline.